Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell. Read by Michael Maloney. The Rue du Coq d'Or, Paris, 7 in the morning. A succession of furious, choking yells from the street. Madame Moss, who kept the little hotel opposite mine, had come out onto the pavement to address a lodger on the 3rd floor. Her bare feet were stuck into sabots and her grey hair was streaming down. "Sacré salope! How many times have I told you not to squish bugs on the wallpaper? Do you think you've bought the hotel, eh? Why can't you throw them out of the window like everyone else? Espèce de traînée!" The Rue du Coq d'Or was a very narrow street. A ravine of tall, leprous houses lurching towards one another in queer attitudes as though they had all been frozen in the act of collapse. All the houses were hotels and packed to the tiles with lodgers, mostly Poles, Arabs and Italians. At the foot of the hotels were tiny bistros, where you could be drunk for the equivalent of a shilling. On Saturday nights, about a third of the male population of the quarter was drunk. It was a fairly rackety place, and yet amid the noise and dirt lived the usual respectable French shopkeepers, keeping themselves to themselves and quietly piling up small fortunes. It was quite a representative Paris slum. My hotel was called the Hotel des Trois Moineaux. The rooms were small and inveterately dirty, for there was no maid, and Madame the Patronne had no time to do any sweeping. Near the ceiling, long lines of bugs marched all day like columns of soldiers, and at night came down ravenously hungry, so that one had to get up every few hours and kill them in hecatombs. It was a dirty place, but homelike, for Madame and her husband were good sorts. The rent of the rooms varied between 30 and 50 francs a week. The lodgers were a floating population, largely foreigners, who used to turn up without luggage, stay a week, and then disappear again. They were of every trade: cobblers, bricklayers, stonemasons, navvies, students, prostitutes, rag pickers. Some of them were fantastically poor. In one of the attics, there was a Bulgarian student who made fancy shoes. From 6 to 12 he sat on his bed, making a dozen pairs of shoes and earning 35 francs. The rest of the day he attended lectures at the Sorbonne. One room was let to 2 different lodgers, one a day worker and the other a night worker. There were eccentric characters in the hotel. The Paris slums are a gathering place for eccentric people. Poverty frees them from ordinary standards of behavior, just as money frees people from work. Some of the lodgers in our hotel lived lives that were curious beyond words. There were the Rougiers, for instance, an old ragged dwarfish couple who plied an extraordinary trade. They used to sell postcards on the Boulevard Saint-Michel. The curious thing was that the postcards were sold in sealed packets as pornographic ones, but were actually photographs of Chateau on the Loire. The buyers did not discover this till too late, and of course never complained. The Rougier earned about 100 francs a week, and by strict economy managed to be always half-starved and half-drunk. The filth of their room was such that one could smell it on the floor below. According to Madame, neither of the Rougiers had taken off their clothes for 4 years. Or there was the Englishman who lived 6 months of the year in Putney with his parents and 6 months in France. During his time in France, he drank 4 litres of wine a day and 6 litres on Saturdays. He was a gentle, domesticated creature, never rowdy or quarrelsome, and never sober. He would lie in bed till midday, and from then till midnight he was in his corner of the bistro, quietly and methodically soaking. While he soaked, he talked about antique furniture. Except myself, he was the only Englishman in the quarter. I lived in the Coq d'Or quarter for about 1.5 years. One day in summer, I found that I had just 450 francs left, and beyond this, nothing but 36 francs a week, which I earned by giving English lessons. Hitherto I had not thought about the future, but I now realized that I must do something at once. I decided to start looking for a job, and, very luckily as it turned out, I took the precaution of paying 200 francs for a month's rent in advance. With the other 250 francs, besides the English lessons, I could live a month, and in a month I should probably find work. One day there turned up at the hotel a young Italian who called himself a compositor. Madame did not like the look of him and made him pay a week's rent in advance. During this time he managed to prepare some duplicate keys, and on the last night he robbed 12 rooms, including mine. Luckily, he did not find the money that was in my pockets. I was left with just 47 francs, that is, 7 shillings and 10 pence. This put an end to my plans of looking for work. I'd now got to live at the rate of about 6 francs a day, and from the start it was too difficult to leave much thought for anything else. It was now that my experiences of poverty began. For 6 francs a day, if not actual poverty, is on the fringe of it. 6 francs is a shilling, and you can live on a shilling a day in Paris if you know how. But it is a complicated business. It is altogether curious, your first contact with poverty. You have thought so much about poverty. It is the thing you have feared all your life, and it is also utterly and prosaically different. You thought it would be quite simple. It is extraordinarily complicated. You thought it would be terrible. It is merely squalid and boring. You discover, for instance, the secrecy attached to poverty. At a sudden stroke, you have been reduced to an income of 6 francs a day, but of course you dare not admit it. You've got to pretend that you're living quite as usual. Every day at mealtimes you go out, ostensibly to a restaurant, and loaf an hour, watching the pigeons. Afterwards, you smuggle your food home in your pockets. Your food is bread and margarine. Sometimes, to keep up appearances, you have to spend 60 centimes on a drink and go correspondingly short of food. Your linen gets filthy, and you run out of soap and razor blades. You discover the extreme precariousness of your 6 francs. Mean disasters happen and rob you of food. You've spent your last 80 centimes on half a litre of milk, and you're boiling it over the spirit lamp. While it boils, a bug runs down your forearm. You give the bug a flick with your nail, and it falls straight into the milk. There is nothing for it but to throw the milk away and go foodless. You go to the greengrocer's to spend 1 franc on a kilogram of potatoes. But one of the pieces that make up the franc is a Belgium piece, and the shopman refuses it. You slink out of the shop and can never go there again. One could multiply these disasters by the 100. They are part of the process of being hard up. You discover what it is like to be hungry. With bread and margarine in your belly, you go out and look into the shop windows. Everywhere there is food insulting you in huge, wasteful piles, whole dead pigs, baskets of hot loaves, great yellow blocks of butter, strings of sausages, vast Gruyere cheeses. You discover the boredom which is inseparable from poverty, the times when you have nothing to do, and being underfed can interest yourself in nothing. For half a day at a time you lie on your bed. This, one could describe it further, but it is all in the same style, is life on 6 francs a day. Thousands of people in Paris live it. Struggling artists and students, prostitutes when their luck is out-of-work people of all kinds. I continued in this style for about 3 weeks. The 47 francs were soon gone, and I had to do what I could on 36 francs a week from the English lessons. Being inexperienced, I handled the money badly, and sometimes I was a day without food. When this happened, I used to sell a few of my clothes, smuggling them out of the hotel in small packets, and taking them to a second-hand shop in the Rue de la Montagne Sainte-Geneviève. These 3 weeks were squalid and uncomfortable, and evidently there was worse coming, for my rent would be due before long. Nevertheless, things were not a quarter as bad as I had expected. For, when you are approaching poverty, you make one discovery which outweighs some of the others. You discover the fact that poverty annihilates the future. Within certain limits, it is actually true that the less money you have, the less you worry. When you have 100 francs in the world, you're liable to the most craven panics. When you have only 3 francs, you are quite indifferent, for 3 francs will feed you till tomorrow, and you can't think further than that. You're bored, but you're not afraid. And there's another feeling that is a great consolation in poverty. It is a feeling of relief, almost of pleasure, at knowing yourself at last genuinely down and out. You have talked so often of going to the dogs, and, well, here are the dogs, and you can stand it. It takes off a lot of anxiety. One day, my English lessons ceased abruptly. The weather was getting hot, and one of my pupils, feeling too lazy to go on with his lessons, dismissed me. The other disappeared, owing me 12 francs. I was left with only 30 centimes. For a day and a half I had nothing to eat, and then, too hungry to put it off any longer, I packed my remaining clothes into my suitcase and took them to the pawn shop. This put an end to all pretense of being in funds, for I could not take my clothes out of the hotel without asking Madame's leave. It was the first time I'd been into a French pawn shop. 40 or 50 people were waiting. One handed one's pledge over the counter and sat down. Presently, when the clerk had assessed its value, he would call out, "Numero such and such, will you take 50 francs?" Sometimes it was only 15 francs, or 10 or 5, whatever it was, the whole room knew it. The clothes I was pawning, together with the suitcase, had cost over £20 and were in good condition. I thought that they must be worth £10, and a quarter of this, one expects quarter value at a pawn shop, was 250 francs. I waited without anxiety. At last the clerk called my number. 70 francs? 70 francs for £10 worth of clothes. But it was no use arguing. I had seen someone else attempt to argue, and the clerk had instantly refused the pledge. I took the money and the pawn ticket and walked out. When I got home, Madame came to meet me. I could see in her eye that she was uneasy about my rent. "Well," she said, "what did you get for your clothes?" 200 francs, I said. "Tiens, well, that's not bad. How expensive those English clothes must be." The lie saved a lot of trouble, and, strangely enough, it came true. A few days later, I did receive exactly 200 francs due to me for a newspaper article, and, though it hurt to do it, I had once paid every penny of it in rent. So, though I came near to starving in the following weeks, I was hardly ever without a roof. It was now absolutely necessary to find work, and I remembered a friend of mine, a Russian waiter named Boris, who might be able to help me. I had first met him in the public ward of a hospital where he was being treated for arthritis in the left leg. He had told me to come to him if I were ever in difficulties. I must say something about Boris, for he was a curious character and my close friend for a long time. He was a big, soldierly man of about 35 and had grown immensely fat from lying in bed. Like most Russian refugees, he'd had an adventurous life. His parents, killed in the revolution, had been rich people, and he'd served through the war in the 2nd Siberian Rifles. After the war, he had first worked in a brush factory, then as a porter, then had become a dishwasher, and had finally worked his way up to be a waiter. When he fell ill, he was at the Hotel Scribe, and taking 100 francs a day in tips. His ambition was to become a maître d'hôtel, save 50,000 francs, and set up a small select restaurant on the right bank. The only things left to Boris by the revolution were his medals and some photographs of his old regiment. He had kept these when everything else went to the pawn shop.
"Ah, mon ami," he would say, "the ups and downs of life. Captain in the Russian army, and then, piff, the revolution. Every penny gone. In 1916, I stayed a week at the Hotel Edouard VII. In 1920, I was trying for a job as night watchman there."
Boris had a queer, changeable nature. Though he had never saved more than a few thousand francs, he took it for granted that in the end he would be able to set up his own restaurant and grow rich. All waiters, I afterwards found, talk and think of this. It is what reconciles them to being waiters.
"Waiting is a gamble," he used to say. "You may die poor. You may make your fortune in a year. You are not paid wages. You depend on tips, 10% of the bill, and a commission from the wine companies on champagne corks. Sometimes the tips are enormous. The barman at Maxim's, for instance, makes 500 francs a day. More than 500 in the season. You never know when a stroke of luck is coming. Once, when I was at the Hotel Royal, an American customer sent for me before dinner and ordered 24 brandy cocktails. I brought them all together on a tray in 24 glasses. "Now, garçon," said the customer, "I'll drink 12 and you'll drink 12. And if you can walk to the door afterwards, you get 100 francs. I walked to the door, and he gave me 100 francs. And every night for 6 days he did the same thing. 12 brandy cocktails and then 100 francs. A few months later, I heard he had been extradited by the American government. Embezzlement. There is something fine, do you not think, about these Americans?
I like Boris, and we had interesting times together. Boris used often to suggest that I should become a waiter.
The life would suit you, he used to say. When you're in work with 100 francs a day and a nice mistress, it's not bad. You say you go in for writing. Writing is bosh. Wait till I can bend this accursed leg, mon ami. And then, if you are ever out of a job, come to me.
Now that I was short of my rent and getting hungry, I remembered Boris's promise and decided to look him up at once. I knew how to scrub dishes, and no doubt he could get me a job in the kitchen. It was a great relief to remember that I had, after all, one influential friend to fall back on. A short time before, Boris had given me an address in the Rue du Marché des Blancs-Manteaux. With a shock, I found it a slummy back street as bad as my own. Boris's hotel was the dirtiest hotel in the street. From its dark doorway there came out a vile, sour odour, a mixture of slops and bouillon zip at 25 centimes a packet. A misgiving came over me. People who drink bouillon zip are starving or near it. Could Boris possibly be earning 100 francs a day? A surly patron sitting in the office said to me, yes, the Russian was at home in the attic. I went up 6 flights of narrow, winding stairs, the bouillon zip growing stronger as one got higher. Boris did not answer when I knocked at his door, so I opened it and went in. The room was an attic 10 feet square, lighted only by a skylight. A long chain of bugs marched slowly across the wall above the bed. Boris was lying asleep, his large belly making a mound under the grimy sheet. As I came in, he woke up.
"Name of Jesus Christ," he said. "Oh, name of Jesus Christ, my back. Curse it. I believe my back is broken."
"What's the matter?" I said. "Are you ill?"
"Not ill. Only starving, yes. Starving to death if this goes on much longer. Besides sleeping on the floor, I have lived on 2 francs a day for a week's past. It is fearful. You have come at a bad moment, mon ami."
It did not seem much use to ask whether Boris still had his job at the Hotel Scribe. I hurried downstairs and bought a loaf of bread. Boris ate half of it, after which he felt better, and told me what was the matter with him. He'd failed to get a job after leaving the hospital because he was still very lame, and he had spent all his money and pawned everything, and finally starved for several days. He had slept a week under the Pont d'Austerlitz. For the past fortnight he'd been living in this room with a friend. It appeared that his friend owed Boris 300 francs and was repaying it by letting him sleep on the floor and allowing him 2 francs a day for food. His friend went to work at 7 in the mornings, and after that Boris would leave his sleeping place beneath the skylight and get into the bed. He could not sleep much even there, owing to the bugs, but it rested his back after the floor. It was a great disappointment, when I had come to Boris for help, to find him even worse off than myself. I explained that I had only about 60 francs left and must get a job immediately. By this time, Boris had eaten the rest of the bread and was feeling cheerful and talkative.
"Good heavens," he said. "What are you worrying about? 60 francs? Why, it's a fortune."
"But do you think there's any chance of getting a job?" I said.
"Chance?" said Boris. "It's a certainty. In fact, I have got something already. There's a new Russian restaurant, which is to open in a few days in the Rue du Commerce. It is une chose entendue that I am to be maître d'hôtel. I can easily get you a job in the kitchen."
"But in the meantime," I said, "I've got to pay my rent before long."
"Oh," he said, "we shall find something. There are people who owe me money, for instance. One of them is bound to pay up before long. Then think of all the women who have been my mistress. A woman never forgets, you know. I have only to ask, and they will help me. Never worry, mon ami. Nothing is easier to get than money.
It was midday before Boris decided to get up. All the clothes he now had left were one suit with one shirt, collar and tie, a pair of shoes almost worn out, and a pair of socks, all holes. He had also an overcoat, which was to be pawned in the last extremity. He had a suitcase, a wretched 20-franc cardboard thing, but very important because the patron of the hotel believed that it was full of clothes. Without that, he would probably have turned Boris out of doors. What it actually contained were medals and photographs, various odds and ends, and huge bundles of love letters. We went to a small cafe off the Rue de Rivoli, a well-known rendezvous of hotel managers and employees. At the back was a dark, cave-like room where all kinds of hotel workers were sitting, smart young waiters, greasy dishwashers, battered old scrubbing women. Everyone had an untouched glass of black coffee in front of him. The place was, in effect, an employment bureau, and the money spent on drinks was the patron's commission. Sometimes a stout, important-looking man, obviously a restaurateur, would come in and speak to the barman, and the barman would call to one of the people at the back of the cafe. But he never called to Boris or me, and we left after 2 hours, as the etiquette was that you could only stay 2 hours for one drink. We went to the Hotel Scribe and waited an hour on the pavement, hoping that the manager would come out, but he never did. Then we dragged ourselves down to the Rue du Commerce, only to find that the new restaurant, which was being redecorated, was shut up and the patron away. It was now night. We had walked 14 kilometers over pavement. Walking was agony to Boris with his game leg, and his optimism wore thinner and thinner as the day went on. When we got back to my room, he was too tired to walk the 3 kilometers back to his hotel, and slept the night on the floor of my room with his coat rolled round his shoes for a pillow. We again failed to find work the next day. Boris suggested that I should go to Les Halles and try for a job as a porter. I arrived at 4:30 in the morning, when the work was getting into its swing. Seeing a short, fat man in a bowler hat directing some porters, I went up to him and asked for work. Before answering, he seized my right hand and felt the palm. "You are strong, eh?" "Very strong," I said. "Bien. Let me see you lift that crate." It was a huge wicker basket full of potatoes. I took hold of it and found that, so far from lifting it, I could not even move it. The man in the bowler hat watched me, then shrugged his shoulders and turned away. I made off. When I had gone some distance, I looked back and saw 4 men lifting the basket onto a cart. It weighed 300 weight, possibly. The man had seen that I was no use, and taken this way of getting rid of me. I had given up the pretense of going out to restaurants, and we used to eat in my room. Boris would contribute his 2 francs, and I 3 or 4 francs, and we would buy bread, potatoes, milk and cheese, and make soup over my spirit lamp. Our linen was getting filthy, and it was 3 weeks since I'd had a bath. It was tobacco that made everything tolerable. We had plenty of tobacco because, some time before, Boris had bought 20 or 30 packets. All this was far worse for Boris than for me. The walking and sleeping on the floor had kept his leg and back in constant pain, and with his vast Russian appetite, he suffered torments of hunger, though he never seemed to grow thinner. On some mornings, he collapsed in the most utter despair. He would lie in bed almost weeping, cursing the friend he lived with, who, of late, had become restive about paying the daily 2 francs. On these days, Boris usually declared himself too ill to go out and look for work. He would lie till evening in the greyish, verminous sheets, smoking and reading old newspapers. My money oozed away, to 8 francs, to 4 francs, to 1 franc, to 25 centimes. We went several days on dry bread, and then I was 2.5 days with nothing to eat whatever. This was an ugly experience. The first day, too inert to look for work, I borrowed a rod and went fishing in the Seine. I hoped to catch enough for a meal, but of course I did not. On the second day, I thought of pawning my overcoat, but it seemed too far to walk to the pawn shop, and I spent the day in bed. It was all I felt equal to without food. Hunger reduces one to an utterly spineless, brainless condition. It is as though one had been turned into a jellyfish, or as though all one's blood had been pumped out and lukewarm water substituted. On the third morning, I realized that I must do something at once, and I decided to go and ask Boris to let me share his 2 francs, at any rate for a day or two. When I arrived, I found Boris in bed and furiously angry.
He has taken it back, the dirty thief. Taken my 2 francs, the dog. He robbed me in my sleep.
It appeared that on the previous night, his friend had flatly refused to pay the daily 2 francs. They had argued, and at last he had consented to hand over the money. He had done it, said Boris, in the most offensive manner, making a little speech about how kind he was, and then in the morning he had stolen the money back before Boris was awake. This was a blow. I was horribly disappointed, for I had allowed my belly to expect food, a great mistake when one is hungry. Boris sat up in bed and reviewed the situation.
Now listen, mon ami, he said. This is a tight corner. We have only 25 centimes between us, and I don't suppose I'll ever be paid my 2 francs again. In any case, he intends clearing out of here. He owes a week's rent, and his idea is to avoid paying that and give me the slip at the same time. We have got to make a vigorous move.
All right, I said, but what can we do? It seems to me that the only thing is to pawn our overcoats and get some food.
We'll do that, of course, said Boris. But I must get my possessions out of this house first. I am going to forestall him and shoot the moon myself. Foutre le camp. Retreat, you understand? Now, listen. We must start by pawning our overcoats. First, go back to your room and fetch your overcoat, then come back here and fetch mine, and smuggle it out under cover of yours. Take them to the pawn shop. You ought to get 20 francs for the 2 with luck. I shall wrap as many of my things as I can carry in a newspaper, and go down and ask the patron the way to the nearest laundry. Of course, he will think the bundle is nothing but dirty linen. Then, afterwards, I can come back and carry my other things out in my pockets. We shall have to abandon my suitcase. The miserable thing only cost 20 francs.
Boris was so pleased with this scheme that he almost forgot being hungry. Its main weakness, that he would have nowhere to sleep after shooting the moon, he ignored. At first it worked well. I went home and fetched my overcoat, that made already 9 kilometers on an empty belly, and smuggled Boris's coat out successfully. Then a hitch occurred. The receiver at the pawn shop refused the coats on the ground that they were not wrapped up in anything. He said that they must be put either in a valise or a cardboard box. This spoiled everything. We had no box of any kind, and with only 25 centimes between us, we could not buy one. I went back and told Boris the bad news.
Merde, he said. That makes it awkward. Well, no matter. We'll put the overcoats in my suitcase.
But how are we to get the suitcase past the patron? I said. It's impossible.
How easily you despair, mon ami. Where is that English obstinacy that I have read of? Courage! We'll manage it.
Boris thought for a while, and then produced another cunning plan. The essential difficulty was to hold the patron's attention for perhaps 5 seconds while we could slip past with the suitcase. As it happened, the patron had just one weak spot, that he was interested in le sport. Boris read an article about bicycle races in an old copy of the Petit Parisien, and then went down and managed to set the patron talking. Meanwhile, with the overcoats under one arm and the suitcase under the other, I sneaked rapidly past the office and out into the street. When I was well away, Boris came and joined me round the corner, and we bolted. And then, after all our trouble, the receiver at the pawn shop again refused the overcoats. He told me one could see his French soul revelling in the pedantry of it, that I had not sufficient papers of identification. My carte d'identité was not enough, and I must show a passport or addressed envelopes. All we could do was to trudge up to my room and get the necessary papers. I left Boris at my room. When I got to the pawn shop, I found that it was now shut and would not open till 4 in the afternoon. It was now about 1:30, and I had walked 12 kilometres and had no food for 60 hours. Fate seemed to be playing a series of extraordinarily unamusing jokes. Then the luck changed as though by a miracle. I was walking home through the Rue Broca when suddenly, glittering on the cobbles, I saw a 5-sou piece. I pounced on it, hurried home, got our other 5-sou piece, and bought a pound of potatoes. There was only enough alcohol in the stove to parboil them, and we had no salt, but we wolfed them, skins and all. After that, we felt like new men. At 4 o'clock, I went back to the pawn shop. I was not hopeful, for if I had only got 70 francs before, what could I expect for 2 shabby overcoats and a cardboard suitcase? Boris had said 20 francs, but I thought it would be 10 francs, or even 5. At last, the clerk called me and said, 50 francs? I believe now that he had mixed my number up with someone else's, for one could not have sold the coats outright for 50 francs. I hurried home and threw the 50-franc note onto the table. Boris turned white as chalk and then, springing up, seized my hand and gave it a grip that almost broke the bones. We ran out, bought bread and wine, a piece of meat and alcohol for the stove, and gorged. It was a marvellous change for the better after 2 bad days. We now had 28 francs in hand and could start looking for work once more. Boris was sleeping on some mysterious terms at the house of a Russian cobbler, and he had managed to borrow another 20 francs from a Russian friend. He had friends, mostly ex-officers like himself, here and there all over Paris. Some were waiters or dishwashers. Some drove taxis. Some had managed to bring money away from Russia and owned garages or dancing halls. In general, the Russian refugees in Paris are hard-working people and have put up with their bad luck far better than one can imagine Englishmen of the same class doing. It was through one of these Russian refugees that Boris heard of something which seemed to promise money. One day he said to me,
"Tell me, mon ami, have you any political opinions?"
"No," I said.
"What I mean," he continued, "is would you object to earning money from communists? It appears there is a Russian secret society in Paris who might do something for us. They are agents. They act as a friendly society, get in touch with exiled Russians, and try to get them to turn Bolshevik. My friend has joined their society. It seems they are correspondents for a Moscow paper, and they want some articles on English politics. If we go to them at once, they may commission you to write the articles." "Me?" I said. "But I don't know anything about politics." "Merde," said Boris. "Neither do they. All you have to do is copy it out of the English papers. We mustn't throw this chance away, mon ami. It might mean hundreds of francs."
I did not like the idea, for the Paris police are very hard on communists, especially if they're foreigners. However, the chance seemed too good to be missed. That afternoon, Boris's friend came to take us to the rendezvous. He insisted on great caution. We loitered casually down the street, marked the doorway we were to enter, it was a laundry, and then strolled back again, keeping an eye on all the windows and cafes. If the place was known as a haunt of communists, it was probably watched. I was frightened, but Boris enjoyed these conspiratorial proceedings and quite forgot that he was about to trade with the slayers of his parents. When we were certain that the coast was clear, we dived quickly into the doorway. In the laundry was a Frenchwoman ironing clothes who told us that the Russian gentleman lived up a staircase across the courtyard. We went up several flights of dark stairs and emerged onto a landing. A strong, surly-looking young man was standing at the top of the stairs. As I came up, he looked at me suspiciously. Boris's friend said something in Russian, and the surly young man led us into a small, shabby room with frosted windows, propaganda posters in Russian lettering, and a huge, crude picture of Lenin tacked on the walls. At a table sat an unshaven Russian in shirt-sleeves. "This is very careless," he said to me. "Why have you come here without a parcel of washing? Everyone who comes here brings washing. It looks as though they were going to the laundry downstairs. Bring a good large bundle next time. We don't want the police on our tracks." This was even more conspiratorial than I had expected. Boris sat down in the only vacant chair, and there was a great deal of talking in Russian. It was queer, standing in the little secret room with its revolutionary posters, listening to a conversation of which I did not understand a word. The Russians talked quickly and eagerly, with smiles and shrugs of the shoulders. I gathered that 20 francs was being demanded for an entrance fee, apparently. Boris produced our precious store of money and paid 5 francs on account. At this, the unshaven man began to question me in French, making notes on a slip of paper. Was I a communist, he said. By sympathy, I answered. Did I understand the political situation in England? Oh, of course, of course. I made some contemptuous remarks about the Labour Party. Both men nodded gravely. The unshaven one said, "Évidemment, you have a thorough knowledge of conditions in England. Could you undertake to write a series of articles for a Moscow weekly paper? We will give you the particulars." "Certainly," I said. "Then, comrade, you will hear from us by the first post tomorrow, or possibly the second post. Our rate of pay is 150 francs an article. Remember to bring a parcel of washing next time you come. Au revoir, comrade." We went downstairs, looking carefully out of the laundry to see that there was no one in the street, and slipped out. Next morning, when I heard the postman, I rushed down for my letter. To my disappointment, it had not come. I stayed at home for the second post. Still no letter. When 3 days had gone by and I had not heard from the secret society, we gave up hope, deciding that they must have found somebody else to do their articles. 10 days later, we made another visit to the office of the secret society, taking care to bring a parcel that looked like washing. And the secret society had vanished. The woman in the laundry knew nothing. She simply said that "ces messieurs" had left some days ago after trouble about the rent. It was a consolation that we had paid only 5 francs instead of 20. And that was the last we ever heard of the secret society. Who or what they really were, nobody knew. Personally, I do not think they had anything to do with the Communist Party. I think they were simply swindlers who preyed upon Russian refugees by extracting entrance fees to an imaginary society. It was quite safe, and no doubt they're still doing it in some other city. They were clever fellows and played their part admirably. Their office looked exactly as a secret communist office should look, and as for that touch about bringing a parcel of washing, it was genius. For 3 more days we continued traipsing about looking for work, coming home for diminishing meals of soup and bread in my bedroom. There were now 2 gleams of hope. In the first place, Boris had heard of a possible job at an hotel near the Place de la Concorde, and in the second, the patron of the new restaurant in the Rue du Commerce had at last come back. We went down in the afternoon and saw him. The patron was a short, fattish, very dignified man with wavy grey hair, dressed in a smart double-breasted flannel suit and smelling of scent. Boris told me that he was an ex-colonel of the Russian army. They talked together in Russian for a few minutes, then the patron came over towards me and suddenly informed me that it was all entendu. Boris was to be maître d'hôtel when the restaurant opened, and I plongeur, with a chance of rising to lavatory attendant if trade was good. When would the restaurant open? I asked. "Exactly a fortnight from today," said the patron. Then, with obvious pride, he showed us over the restaurant. It was a smallish place, consisting of a bar, a dining room, and a kitchen no bigger than the average bathroom. The patron was decorating it in a trumpery, picturesque style. It was a matter of sham beams stuck on the plaster and the like, and proposed to call it the Auberge de Jean Cottard, to give it a medieval effect. He was also having the bar decorated with indecent pictures by an artist from the Salon. Finally, he gave us each an expensive cigarette, and we went home. I felt strongly that we should never get any good from this restaurant. The patron had looked to me like a cheat, and, what was worse, an incompetent cheat. But Boris, seeing himself a maître d'hôtel once more, would not be discouraged. When our money came to an end, I stopped looking for work and was another day without food. Then the luck changed abruptly. One night, at about 10 o'clock, I heard an eager shout from the street. I got up and went to the window. Boris was there, waving his stick and beaming. Before speaking, he dragged a bent loaf from his pocket and threw it up to me.
Mon ami, he said. Mon cher ami, we are saved. The hotel near the Place de la Concorde. 500 francs a month and food. I have been working there today. Name of Jesus Christ, how I have eaten!
After 10 or 12 hours' work, and with his game leg, his first thought had been to walk 3 kilometres to my hotel and tell me the good news. What was more, he told me to meet him in the Tuileries the next day during his afternoon interval. At the appointed time, I met Boris on a public bench. He undid his waistcoat and produced a large, crushed newspaper packet. In it were some minced veal, a wedge of camembert cheese, bread, and an eclair, all jumbled together.
Voila! That's all I could smuggle out for you. The doorkeeper is a cunning swine.
While I ate, Boris explained that he was working in the cafeteria of the hotel, that is, in English, the still room. It appeared that the cafeteria was the lowest post in the hotel, and a dreadful come-down for a waiter, but it would do until the auberge de Jean Cottard opened. Meanwhile, I was to meet Boris every day in the Tuileries, and he would smuggle out as much food as he dared. For 3 days we continued with this arrangement, and then all our troubles came to an end, for one of the dishwashers left the hotel, and on Boris's recommendation, I was given a job there myself. The hotel was a vast, grandiose place with a classical facade, and at one side a little dark doorway like a rat hole, which was the service entrance. I arrived at 6:45 in the morning. A stream of men with greasy trousers were hurrying in and being checked by a doorkeeper who sat in a tiny office. I waited, and presently the chef du personnel arrived. He led me down a winding staircase into a narrow passage, deep underground, and so low that I had to stoop in places. It was stiflingly hot and very dark. We passed doorways which let out sometimes a shouting of oaths, sometimes the red glare of a fire, once a shuddering draught from an ice chamber. A passage branched off into a laundry, where an old skulled-faced woman gave me a blue apron and a pile of dishcloths. Then the chef du personnel took me to a tiny underground den, a cellar below a cellar, as it were, where there were a sink and some gas ovens. It was too low for me to stand quite upright, and the temperature was perhaps 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The chef du personnel explained that my job was to fetch meals for the higher hotel employees, who fed in a small dining room above, cleaned their room, and washed their crockery. When he had gone, a waiter, an Italian, thrust a fierce fuzzy head into a doorway and looked down at me. "English, eh?" he said. "Well, I'm in charge here. To me, twisting your neck would be no more than spitting on the floor. And if there's any trouble, they'll believe me, not you. So be careful." After this, I set to work rather hurriedly. Except for about an hour, I was at work from 7 in the morning till 9:15 at night. First at washing crockery, then at scrubbing the tables and floors of the employees' dining room, then at polishing glasses and knives, then at fetching meals, then at washing crockery again, then at fetching more meals and washing more crockery. It was easy work, and I got on well with it, except when I went to the kitchen to fetch meals. The kitchen was like nothing I had ever seen or imagined. A stifling, low-ceilinged inferno of a cellar, red-lit from the fires, and deafening with oaths and the clanging of pots and pans. In the middle were furnaces, where 12 cooks skipped to and fro, their faces dripping sweat in spite of their white caps. Round that were counters where a mob of waiters and plongeurs clamoured with trays. Scullions, naked to the waist, were stoking the fires and scouring huge copper saucepans with sand. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry and a rage. The head cook, a scarlet man with big mustachios, stood in the middle, booming continuously. Ça marche! 2 œufs brouillés! Ça marche! Un Chateaubriand pomme sautée! There were 3 counters, and the first time I went to the kitchen, I took my tray unknowingly to the wrong one. The head cook walked up to me, twisted his moustaches, and looked me up and down. "Where do you come from, idiot?" "From England," I said. "I might have known it." "Well, mon cher Monsieur l'Anglais, may I inform you that you are the son of a whore? And now get to the other counter where you belong." I got this kind of reception every time I went to the kitchen, for I always made some mistake and was cursed accordingly. At 4:30, the Italian told me that I could stop working, but that it wasn't worth going out as we began again at 5. After that, I worked again till 9:15, when the waiter put his head into a doorway and told me to leave the rest of the crockery. To my astonishment, after calling me pig and mackerel all day, he had suddenly grown quite friendly. "That'll do, mon petit," he said. "Come up and have your dinner. The hotel allows us 2 liters of wine each, and I've stolen another bottle." We had an excellent dinner from the leavings of the higher employees. The waiter told me stories about his love affairs, and about 2 men whom he had stabbed in Italy, and about how he had dodged his military service. I was tired and drenched with sweat, but I felt a new man after a day's solid food. The work did not seem difficult, and I felt that this job would suit me. It was not certain, however, that it would continue, for I'd been engaged as an extra for the day only at 25 francs. The sour-faced doorkeeper counted out the money, less 50 centimes, which he said was for insurance, a lie I discovered afterwards. After this, the chef du personnel appeared and spoke to me. Like the waiter, he had grown more genial on seeing that I was willing to work. "We will give you a permanent job if you like," he said. "Will you sign on for a month?" Here was a job at last, and I was ready to jump at it. Then I remembered the Russian restaurant due to open in a fortnight. It seemed hardly fair to promise working a month and then leave in the middle. I said that I had other work in prospect. Could I be engaged for a fortnight? But at that the chef du personnel shrugged his shoulders. I told him I would work. As it turned out, it was 6 weeks before the Auberge de Gérin-Cottard even showed signs of opening. In the meantime, I worked at the hotel 4 days a week in the cafeterie, 1 day helping the waiter on the 4th floor, and 1 day replacing the woman who washed up for the dining room. My day off, luckily, was Sunday, but sometimes another man was ill and I had to work that day as well. The hours were from 7 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon, and from 5 in the evening until 9. By the ordinary standards of a Paris plongeur, these were exceptionally short hours. Our cafeterie was lighted by 1 dim electric bulb and 4 or 5 gas fires that sent out a fierce red breath. There was a thermometer there, and the temperature never fell below 110 degrees Fahrenheit. It neared 130 at some times of day. At one end were 5 service lifts, and at the other an ice cupboard where we stored milk and butter. 2 men worked in the cafeterie besides Boris and myself. One was Mario, a huge, excitable Italian. The other, a hairy, uncouth animal we called the Magyar. The work was spasmodic. We were never idle, but the real work only came in bursts of 2 hours at a time. At 8, the guests upstairs began to wake up and demand breakfast. A sudden banging and yelling would break out all through the basement. Bells rang on all sides. Blue-aproned men rushed through the passages. Our service lifts came down with a simultaneous crash, and the waiters on all 5 floors began shouting Italian oaths down the shafts. I don't remember all our duties, but they included making tea, coffee, and chocolate, fetching meals from the kitchen, wines from the cellar, and fruits and so forth from the dining room, slicing bread, making toast, rolling pats of butter, measuring jam, opening milk cans, counting lumps of sugar, boiling eggs, cooking porridge, pounding ice, grinding coffee. All this for up to 200 customers. Everything we sent up in the service lifts had to be covered by a voucher, and the vouchers had to be carefully filed, and there was trouble if even a lump of sugar was lost. Besides this, we had to supply the staff with bread and coffee and fetch the meals for the waiters upstairs. All in all, it was a complicated job. At times, we were hopelessly behind, and customers would have gone without their breakfast, but Mario always pulled us through. He had worked 14 years in the cafeteria, and he had the skill that never wastes a second between jobs. The way he would stretch his great arms right across the cafeteria to fill a coffee pot with one hand and boil an egg with the other, at the same time watching toast and shouting directions to the Magyar, and between whiles singing snatches from Rigoletto, was beyond all praise. The patron knew his value, and he was paid 1,000 francs a month, instead of 500 like the rest of us. The breakfast pandemonium stopped at 10:30. Then we scrubbed the cafeteria table, swept the floor, and polished the brasswork. The customers' luncheon hour between 12 and 2 was another period of turmoil like the breakfast hour. By this time the cooks had sweated in front of their furnaces for 4 or 5 hours, and their tempers were all warmed up. At 2, we were suddenly free men. It was strange coming up into the street from those firelit cellars. The air seemed blindingly clear and cold, like Arctic summer. At 5:15 we went back to the hotel. Till 6:30 there were no orders, and we used this time to do odd jobs. Then the grand turmoil of the day started, the dinner hour. The essence of the situation was that 200 people were demanding individually different meals of 5 or 6 courses, and that 50 or 60 people had to cook and serve them and clean up the mess afterwards. And at this time, when the work was doubled, the whole staff were tired out, and a number of them were drunk. I wish I could be Zola for a little while, just to describe that dinner hour. The chargings to and fro in the narrow passages, the collisions, the struggling with crates and trays and blocks of ice, the heat, the darkness, the furious festering quarrels, they pass description. It was only later, when I understood the working of the hotel, that I saw order in all this chaos. At 8:30, the work stopped very suddenly. We were not free till 9, but we used to throw ourselves full length on the floor and lie there, resting our legs. 4 days of the week passed like this. By far my best time at the hotel was when I went to help Valenti, the waiter on the 4th floor. We worked in a small pantry which communicated with the cafeteria by service lifts. It was delightfully cool after the cellars, and the work was chiefly polishing silver and glasses, which is a humane job. My bad day was when I washed up for the dining room. I had to wash crockery, silver, knives and glasses. It meant 13 hours' work, and I used between 30 and 40 dishcloths during the day. The antiquated methods used in France doubled the work of washing up. Plate racks are unheard of, and there are no soap flakes, only treacly soft soap, which refuses to lather in the hard Paris water. It was amusing to think that only a double door was between us and the dining room. There sat the customers in all their splendour, and here, just a few feet away, we in our disgusting filth. For it really was disgusting filth. There was no time to sweep the floor till evening, and we slithered about in a compound of soapy water, lettuce leaves, torn paper, and trampled food. A dozen waiters with their coats off, showing their sweaty armpits, sat at the table sticking their thumbs into cream pots. There were only 2 sinks, and no washing basin, and it was nothing unusual for a waiter to wash his face in the water in which clean crockery was rinsing. But the customers saw nothing of this. In a few days I had grasped the main principle on which the hotel was run. Cooks, waiters, and plongeurs differ greatly in outlook, but they're all alike in being proud of their efficiency. Undoubtedly the most workmanlike class, and the least servile, are the cooks. The cook looks upon himself as a skilled workman. He knows his power, knows that he alone makes or mars a restaurant, and that if he is 5 minutes late, everything is out of gear. He makes it a point of honour to insult everyone below the head waiter, and he takes a genuine artistic pride in his work, which demands very great skill. The difficulty is in doing everything to time. Between breakfast and luncheon, the head cook would receive orders for several hundred dishes, all to be served at different times. He cooked few of them himself, but he gave instructions about all of them and inspected them before they were sent up. He was an insufferable bully, but he was also an artist. The waiter's outlook is quite different. His skill is chiefly in being servile. His work gives him the mentality, not of a workman, but of a snob. He lives perpetually in sight of rich people, stands at their tables, listens to their conversation, sucks up to them with smiles and discreet little jokes. The result is that the waiter comes to identify himself with his employers. He will take pains to serve a meal in style because he feels that he is participating in the meal himself. The plongeurs, again, have a different outlook. Theirs is a job which offers no prospects, is intensely exhausting, and has no trace of skill or interest. All that is required of them is to be constantly on the run and to put up with long hours and a stuffy atmosphere. They have no way of escaping, for they cannot save a penny from their wages, and working from 60 to 100 hours a week leaves them no time to train for anything else. The best they can hope for is to find a slightly softer job as night watchman or lavatory attendant. And yet the plongeurs, low as they are, also have a kind of pride. It is the pride of the drudge, a man who is equal to no matter what quantity of work. At that level, the mere power to go on working like an ox is about the only virtue attainable. Débrouillard is what every plongeur wants to be called. A débrouillard is a man who, even when he is told to do the impossible, will se débrouiller, get it done somehow. One of the kitchen plongeurs at the hotel, a German, was well known as a débrouillard. One night, an English lord came to the hotel, and the waiters were in despair, for the lord had asked for peaches, and there were none in stock. It was late at night, and the shops would be shut. "Leave it to me," said the German. He went out, and in 10 minutes he was back with 4 peaches. He had gone into a neighbouring restaurant and stolen them. That is what is meant by a débrouillard. The English lord paid for the peaches at 20 francs each. Thus, everyone in the hotel had his sense of honour, and when the press of work came, we were all ready for a grand concerted effort to get through it. The constant war between the different departments also made for efficiency, for everyone clung to his own privileges and tried to stop the others idling and pilfering. This is the good side of hotel work. In a hotel, a huge and complicated machine is kept running by an inadequate staff because every man has a well-defined job and does it scrupulously. But there is a weak point, and it is this, that the job the staff are doing is not necessarily what the customer pays for. The customer pays, as he sees it, for good service. The employee is paid, as he sees it, for the imitation of good service. The result is that though hotels are miracles of punctuality, they are worse than the worst private houses in the things that matter. Take cleanliness, for example. The dirt, as soon as one penetrated into the service quarters, was revolting. Our cafeteria had 1-year-old filth in all the dark corners, and the bread bin was infested with cockroaches. The others laughed when I wanted to wash my hands before touching the butter. Yet we scrubbed the tables and polished the brasswork regularly because we had orders to do that. But we had no orders to be genuinely clean, and in any case we had no time for it. We were simply carrying out our duties, and as our first duty was punctuality, we saved time by being dirty. In the kitchen the dirt was worse. It is not a figure of speech, it is a mere statement of fact to say that a French cook will spit in the soup, that is, if he's not going to drink it himself. When a steak is brought up for the head cook's inspection, he does not handle it with a fork. He picks it up in his fingers and slaps it down, runs his thumb round the dish and licks it to taste the gravy, steps back and contemplates the piece of meat like an artist judging a picture, then presses it lovingly into place with his fingers, every one of which he's licked 100 times that morning. Whenever one pays more than, say, 10 francs for a dish of meat in Paris, one may be certain that it has been fingered in this manner. In very cheap restaurants it is different. There, the same trouble is not taken over the food, and it is just forked out of the pan and flung onto a plate, without handling. Roughly speaking, the more one pays for food, the more sweat and spittle one is obliged to eat with it. In spite of all this, we were one of the dozen most expensive hotels in Paris, and the customers paid startling prices. The ordinary charge for a night's lodging, not including breakfast, was 200 francs. If a customer had a title or was reputed to be a millionaire, all his charges went up automatically. One morning on the 4th floor, an American who was on a diet wanted only salt and hot water for his breakfast. Valenti was furious. "Jesus Christ," he said, "what about my 10%? 10% of salt and water?" And he charged 25 francs for the breakfast. The customer paid without a murmur. According to Boris, The same kind of thing went on in all Paris hotels, or at least in all the big, expensive ones. But I imagine that the customers at our hotel were especially easy to swindle, for they were mostly Americans, with a sprinkling of English, no French, and seemed to know nothing whatever about good food. They would stuff themselves with disgusting American cereals, and eat marmalade at tea, and drink vermouth after dinner. One customer, from Pittsburgh, dined every night in his bedroom on grape nuts, scrambled eggs, and cocoa. Perhaps it hardly matters whether such people are swindled or not. Time went on, and the Auberge de Jean Cottard showed no signs of opening. Boris and I went down there one day during our afternoon interval and found that none of the alterations had been done, except the indecent pictures. The patron greeted us with his usual blandness, and the next instant turned to me, his prospective dishwasher, and borrowed 5 francs. After that, I felt certain that the restaurant would never get beyond talk. The patron, however, again named the opening for exactly a fortnight from today, and introduced us to the woman who is to do the cooking, a Baltic Russian, 5 feet tall, and a yard across the hips. In a fortnight, I got so used to the routine of a plongeur's life that I could hardly imagine anything different. It was a life without much variation. At 5:45, one woke with a sudden start, tumbled into grease-stiffened clothes, and hurried out with dirty face and protesting muscles. It was dawn, and the sky was like a vast flat wall of cobalt, with roofs and spires of black paper pasted upon it. Drowsy men were sweeping the pavements with 10-foot besoms, and ragged families picking over the dustbins. Trams filled with workmen boomed gloomily past. One hastened down to the metro station, fought for a place, and stood jammed in the swaying mass of passengers. And then one descended into the labyrinth of the hotel basement and forgot daylight until 2 o'clock, when the sun was hot and the town black with people and cars. After my first week at the hotel, I always spent the afternoon interval in sleeping, or, when I had money, in a bistro. The whole staff wasted their leisure in this way. Sometimes 6 plongeurs would make up a party and go to an abominable brothel in the Rue de Sieyès, where the charge was only 5 francs 25 centimes, 10 halfpenny. The plongeurs' wages did not allow them to marry, and no doubt work in the basement does not encourage fastidious feelings. For another 4 hours one was in the cellars, and then one emerged, sweating, into the cool street. It was lamplight, that strange purplish gleam of the Paris lamps, and beyond the river the Eiffel Tower flashed from top to bottom with zigzag sky signs like enormous snakes of fire. Streams of cars glided silently to and fro, and women, exquisite looking in the dim light, strolled up and down the arcade. Generally from 10 to midnight I went to a little bistro in our street, an underground place frequented by Arab navvies. It was a bad place for fights, and I sometimes saw bottles thrown, but as a rule the Arabs fought among themselves and let Christians alone. It was the typical life of a plongeur, and it did not seem a bad life at the time. I had no sensation of poverty, for even after paying my rent and setting aside enough for tobacco and journeys and my food on Sundays, I still had 4 francs a day for drinks, and 4 francs was wealth. There was a sort of heavy contentment, the contentment a well-fed beast might feel in a life which had become so simple. But nothing could be simpler than the life of a plongeur. He lives in a rhythm between work and sleep, without time to think, hardly conscious of the exterior world. One night, in the small hours, there was a murder just beneath my window. I was woken by a fearful uproar, and going to the window saw a man lying flat on the stones below. I could see the murderers, 3 of them, flitting away at the end of the street. Some of us went down and found that the man was quite dead, his skull cracked with a piece of lead piping. But the thing that strikes me in looking back is that I was in bed and asleep within 3 minutes of the murder. So were most of the people in the street. We just made sure that the man was done for and went straight back to bed. We were working people, and where was the sense of wasting sleep over a murder? With 30 francs a week to spend on drinks, I could take part in the social life of the quarter. We had some jolly evenings on Saturdays in the little bistro at the foot of the Hôtel des Trois Moineaux. The brick-floored room, 15 feet square, was packed with 20 people and the air dim with smoke. The noise was deafening, for everyone was either talking at the top of his voice or singing. Sometimes it was just a confused din of voices. Sometimes everyone would burst out together in the same song, the Marseillaise or the Internationale, or Les Fraises et les Framboises. Isaiah, a great clumping peasant girl who worked 14 hours a day in a glass factory, sang a song about Elle a perdu son pantalon tout en dansant le charleston. Her friend Marinette, a thin, dark Corsican girl of obstinate virtue, tied her knees together and danced the danse du ventre. The old Rougier wandered in and out, cadging drinks and trying to tell a long, involved story about someone who had once cheated them over a bedstead. The Englishman, cadaverous and silent, sat in his corner, quietly boozing. People played darts and diced for drinks. Manuel, a Spaniard, dragged the girls to the bar and shook the dice box against their bellies for luck. Madame stood at the bar, rapidly pouring chopines of wine through the pewter funnel. Everyone was very happy, overwhelmingly certain that the world was a good place, and we a notable set of people. For an hour the noise scarcely slackened. Then about midnight there was a piercing shout of "Citoyen!" and the sound of a chair falling over. A blond, red-faced workman had risen to his feet and was banging a bottle on the table. Everyone stopped singing. The word went round, "Shh, Fureur is starting." Fureur was a strange creature, a Limousin stonemason who worked steadily all the week and drank himself into a kind of paroxysm on Saturdays. He had lost his memory and could not remember anything before the war. The queer thing about him was that, although he was a communist, when sober, he turned violently patriotic when drunk. He started the evening with good communist principles, but after 4 or 5 litres he was challenging all foreigners to fight. It was at this stage that he made his speech, for he made a patriotic speech every Saturday night. The speech was always the same, word for word. It ran, "Citizens of the Republic, are there any Frenchmen here? If there are any Frenchmen here, I rise to remind them, in effect, of the glorious days of the war. When one looks back upon that time of comradeship and heroism, one looks back, in effect, upon that time of comradeship and heroism. When one remembers the heroes who are dead, one remembers, in effect, the heroes who are dead. Citizens of the Republic, I was wounded at Verdun." Here he showed the wound he'd received at Verdun. There were shouts of applause. The word was passed round to Bête Fureur. With a wink to the others, someone called for silence and asked Fureur to sing the Marseillaise. He sang it well in a fine bass voice. Veritable tears rolled down his cheeks. He was too drunk to see that everyone was laughing at him. Then, before he had finished, 2 strong workmen seized him by either arm and held him down, while Isaiah shouted, "Vive l'Allemagne!" just out of his reach. Fureur's face went purple at such infamy. Everyone in the bistro began shouting together, "Vive l'Allemagne! À bas la France!" while Fureur struggled to get at them. But suddenly he spoiled the fun. His face turned pale and doleful, his limbs went limp, and before anyone could stop him, he was sick on the table. Then Madame hoisted him like a sack and carried him up to bed. In the morning he reappeared, quiet and civil, and bought a copy of L'Humanité. The table was wiped with a cloth. Madame brought more bottles and loaves of bread, and we settled down to serious drinking. There were gaps in the noise now. People had begun to talk about their love affairs and the war. The doors and windows were open to cool the room. We were still happy, but meditatively. By 1 o'clock, we were not happy any longer. We felt the joy of the evening wearing thin and called hastily for more bottles, but Madame was watering the wine now, and it did not taste the same. Men grew quarrelsome. People seized each other by the arm and began long rambling confessions, and were angry when these were not listened to. By 1:30, the last drop of pleasure had evaporated, leaving nothing but headaches. We perceived that we were not splendid inhabitants of a splendid world, but a crew of underpaid workmen grown squalidly and dismally drunk. At last, it was no use keeping it up any longer. Several men went out into the yard behind the bistro and were sick. We crawled up to bed and stayed there 10 hours. Most of my Saturday nights went in this way. On the whole, the 2 hours when one was perfectly and wildly happy seemed worth the subsequent headache. For many men in the quarter, Unmarried and with no future to think of, the weekly drinking bout was the one thing that made life worth living. One day, when we'd been at the hotel 5 or 6 weeks, Boris disappeared without notice. In the evening, I found him waiting for me in the Rue de Rivoli. He slapped me gaily on the shoulder.
"Free at last, mon ami. You can give notice in the morning. The auberge opens tomorrow."
"Tomorrow?" I said.
"Well, possibly we shall need a day or two to arrange things, but at any rate, no more cafeteria. My tailcoat is out of pawn already." His manner was so hearty that I felt sure there was something wrong, and I did not at all want to leave my safe and comfortable job at the hotel. However, I had promised him, so I gave notice, and the next morning at 7 went down to the auberge de Johan-Cottard. It was locked, and I went in search of Boris, who had once more bolted from his lodgings and taken a room in the Rue de la Croix-Niver. I found him asleep, together with a girl whom he'd picked up the night before, and who he told me was of a very sympathetic temperament. As to the restaurant, he said that it was all arranged. There were only a few little things to be seen to before we opened. At 10, I managed to get Boris out of bed, and we unlocked the restaurant. At a glance, I saw what the few little things amounted to. It was briefly this, that the alterations had not been touched since our last visit. The stoves for the kitchen had not arrived, the water and electricity had not been laid on, and there was all manner of painting, polishing, and carpentering to be done. Nothing short of a miracle could open the restaurant within 10 days. It was obvious what had happened. The patron was short of money, and he had engaged the staff, there were 4 of us, in order to use us instead of workmen. He would be getting our services almost free, for waiters are paid no wages, and though he would have to pay me, he would not be feeding me till the restaurant opened. In effect, he had swindled us of several hundred francs by sending for us before the restaurant was open. We had thrown up a good job for nothing. Boris, however, was full of hope. He had only one idea in his head, namely, that here at last was a chance of being a waiter and wearing a tailcoat once more. For this he was quite willing to do 10 days' work unpaid. We cleaned out the cellars, fixed the shelves, polished the woodwork, whitewashed the ceiling, but the main work, the plumbing and gas fitting and electricity, was still not done because the patron could not pay the bills. Evidently he was almost penniless, for he refused the smallest charges, and he had a trick of swiftly disappearing when asked for money. Meanwhile, I was getting hungrier and hungrier. I had left the hotel with 30 francs, and I had to go back immediately to a diet of dry bread. Boris had managed to extract an advance of 60 francs from the patron, but he had spent half of it in redeeming his waiter's clothes, and half on the girl of sympathetic temperament. He borrowed 3 francs a day from Jules, the second waiter, and spent it on bread. Sometimes the cook came to see how things were getting on, and when she saw that the kitchen was still bare of pots and pans, she usually wept. 10 days passed. It was a bad time. I told the patron that I could not continue working without an advance on my wages. As blandly as usual, he promised the advance, and then, according to his custom, vanished. Then, next morning, the luck changed. Evidently, the patron had come to an understanding with his creditors, for he arrived with money in his pockets and gave me an advance. Boris and I bought macaroni and a piece of horse's liver and had our first hot meal in 10 days. The workmen were brought in and the alterations made. On the last night, we were at work till 2 in the morning getting things ready. The crockery did not arrive till 8, and being new, had all to be washed. The cutlery did not arrive till the next morning, nor the linen either, and we had to dry the crockery with a shirt of the patron's and an old pillow slip belonging to the concierge. Boris and I did all the work. Jules was skulking, and the patron and his wife sat in the bar with some Russian friends drinking success to the restaurant. The cook was in the kitchen with her head on the table, crying because she was expected to cook for 50 people, and there were not pots and pans enough for 10. Jules and I missed the last metro home and had to sleep on the floor of the restaurant. First thing we saw in the morning were 2 large rats sitting on the kitchen table eating from a ham that stood there. It seemed a bad omen. The patron had engaged me as a kitchen plongeur. That is, my job was to wash up, keep the kitchen clean, prepare vegetables, make tea, coffee and sandwiches, do the simpler cooking, and run errands. The terms were, as usual, 500 francs a month and food, but I had no free day,
and no fixed working hours. At the hotel, I had seen catering at its best, with unlimited money and good organization. Now, at the auberge, I learned how things are done in a thoroughly bad restaurant. I should add, by the way, that the auberge was not a cheap eating house. We did not provide an adequate meal at less than 25 francs, and we were picturesque and artistic, which sent up our social standing. There were the indecent pictures in the bar, and the sham beams on the walls, electric lights done up as candlesticks, peasant pottery, and the patron and the head waiter were Russian officers, and many of the customers titled Russian refugees. In short, we were decidedly chic. Nevertheless, the conditions behind the kitchen door were suitable for a pigsty. The kitchen measured 15 feet long by 8 broad. Half this space was taken up by the stoves and tables, and there was only room for one dustbin. This used to be crammed full by midday, and the floor was normally an inch deep in a compost of trampled food. We had 3 gas stoves without ovens, and all joints had to be sent out to the bakery. There was no larder. Our substitute for one was a half-roof shed in the yard with a tree growing in the middle of it. The meat, vegetables and so forth lay on the bare earth, raided by rats and cats. There was no hot water laid on. Water for washing up had to be heated in pans, and as there was no room for these on the stoves when meals were cooking, most of the plates had to be washed in cold water. This, with soft soap and the hard Paris water, meant scraping the grease off with bits of newspaper. Owing to some scamping in the installation, the electric light usually fused at 8 in the evening. The patron allowed us 3 candles in the kitchen, and the cook said 3 were unlucky, so we had only 2. In these conditions, the cook and I were expected to serve 30 or 40 meals a day and would later on be serving 100. The cook's working hours were from 8 in the morning till midnight, and mine from 7 in the morning till 12:30 the next morning. 17.5 hours almost without a break. We never had time to sit down till 5 in the afternoon, and even then there was no seat except the top of the dustbin. Boris, who lived nearby and hadn't to catch the last metro home, worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. Such hours, though not usual, are nothing extraordinary in Paris. Life settled at once into a routine that made the hotel seem like a holiday. Every morning at 6 I drove myself out of bed. By 7 I was in the desolation of the cold, filthy kitchen, with the potato skins and bones and fishtails littered on the floor, and a pile of plates stuck together in their grease, waiting from overnight. I could not start on the plates yet because the water was cold and I had to fetch milk and make coffee, for the others arrived at 8 and expected to find coffee ready. Also, there were always several copper saucepans to clean. Those copper saucepans are the bane of a plongeur's life. They have to be scoured with sand and bunches of chain, 10 minutes to each one, and then polished on the outside. Fortunately, the art of making them has been lost, and they are gradually vanishing from French kitchens. When I began on the plates, the cook would take me away to begin skinning onions. When I began on the onions, the patron would arrive and send me out to buy cabbages. When I came back with the cabbages, the patron's wife would tell me to go out and buy a pot of rouge. By the time I came back, there would be more vegetables waiting, and the plates were still not done. In this way, our incompetence piled one job on another throughout the day, everything in arrears. Till 10, things went comparatively easily, and no one lost his temper. But at 10, the waiters began clamouring for their lunch, which they had early, and at 11 the first customers would be arriving. Suddenly, everything became hurry and bad temper. There was an atmosphere of muddle, petty spite and exasperation. It was unbearably cramped in the kitchen, and the dishes had to be put on the floor. One had to be thinking constantly about not stepping on them. The cook's vast buttocks banged against me as she moved to and fro. A ceaseless, nagging chorus of orders streamed from her. "Unspeakable idiot! How many times have I told you not to bleed the beetroots? Quick! Let me get to the sink! Put those knives away! Get on with the potatoes! Oh, leave those potatoes alone! Didn't I tell you to skim the bouillon? Take that can of water off the stove! Never mind the washing up! Chop this celery! No, not like that, you fool! Like this! Look at you letting those peas boil over! Now get to work and scale these herrings! Look! You call this plate clean? Wipe it on your apron! Get me down that saucepan! No, the other one!" This went on till 3 o'clock without much variation. From 3 to 5 was a fairly slack time for the waiters, but I was working my fastest, for there was a pile of dirty plates waiting, and it was a race to get them done, or partly done, before dinner began. By 5, the cook and I were feeling unsteady on our feet, not having eaten or sat down since 7. We used to collapse, she on the dustbin and I on the floor, drink a bottle of beer and apologize for some of the things we'd said in the morning. At 5:30, the hurry and quarrelling began again, and now worse than before, because everyone was tired out. The cook and I generally found time to eat our dinner between 10 and 11 o'clock. At midnight, the cook would steal a packet of food for her husband, stow it under her clothes, and make off, whimpering that she would give notice in the morning. Jules also left at midnight. Between 12 and 5:30, I did what I could to finish the washing up. There was no time to attempt doing the work properly, and I used to simply rub the grease off the plates with table napkins. As for the dirt on the floor, I let it lie, or swept the worst of it out of sight under the stoves. At 12:30, I would put on my coat and hurry out. Generally, I was in bed by 1:30. Sometimes I missed the train and had to sleep on the floor of the restaurant, but it hardly mattered, for I could have slept on cobblestones at that time.